My daughter-in-law pushed my wheelchair to the bus stop on a rainy Tuesday morning, smiled sweetly, and said she'd be right back with my son. 3 hours later, as the rain soaked through my jacket and my phone battery died, I realized they weren't coming back. They thought they had abandoned a helpless old woman with nothing but a disability check and fading memories. They had no idea they had just awakened a retired accountant who still remembered exactly where every penny of their trust fund was hidden. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 68, I had spent the last 2 years learning to navigate a world that suddenly seemed designed to exclude me. The stroke had been swift and merciless, stealing the use of my left leg and leaving me dependent on a wheelchair for anything beyond the shortest distances. More devastating than the physical limitations, however, was the way it had shifted the entire dynamic of my family. For 43 years, I had been the chief financial officer of Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm in downtown Portland. I had built my career on precision, on seeing patterns others missed, on understanding the intricate dance of numbers that told the real story of people's lives. My colleagues had called me the numbers whisperer, a woman who could spot financial irregularities from across a crowded spreadsheet and who had saved countless businesses from bankruptcy through careful analysis and strategic planning. Now, according to my son Daniel and his wife Rebecca, I was just another burden to be managed. Daniel, my 44-year-old son, had inherited his father's gentle nature, but lacked the backbone that had made my late husband such a formidable business partner. Rebecca, his wife of 12 years, was a woman who measured success by the size of her social media following and the thread count of her designer sheets. She had married into our family when Daniel was still riding the wave of his inheritance from his father, and had spent the years since treating our family's financial resources as her personal shopping account. The change in their attitude toward me had been gradual at first. In the immediate aftermath of my stroke, they had been attentive, concerned, even loving. Daniel had flown in from Seattle, where he worked as a software consultant, and Rebecca had taken a temporary leave from her job as a marketing coordinator to help with my care. But as the weeks turned to months and it became clear that my recovery would be measured in small increments rather than dramatic improvements, their concern had slowly curdled into resentment. The first sign had been the way Rebecca began to speak about me in the third person, even when I was sitting right there. "She's having a good day today," she would tell Daniel, as if my ability to understand language had somehow been compromised along with my mobility. "She ate most of her breakfast." The infantilization was subtle but constant, a steady erosion of my dignity that felt more deliberate than unconscious. Then came the financial discussions, hushed conversations that they thought I couldn't hear from my bedroom. Rebecca's voice would drop to a whisper when she talked about the cost of my care, about the modifications needed for the house, about the impact on their own financial planning. Daniel, to his credit, had initially pushed back against her suggestions that we explore alternative living arrangements, but his resistance had weakened over time. The house had been the first real battleground. The split-level home I had shared with my husband for 37 years was no longer accessible to me in my wheelchair. The stairs to the second floor might as well have been Mount Everest, and the narrow doorways and tight corners of the first floor made navigation difficult and sometimes impossible. Rebecca had been quick to point out that the house was clearly too big for me now, that it would be so much easier if I moved into a smaller, more manageable space. What she hadn't said, but what hung in the air like smoke, was that the house represented a significant financial asset. Located in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods, it has appreciated considerably over the decades. The equity in that house, combined with my retirement accounts and the life insurance payout from my husband's death, represented a substantial nest egg that I had always intended to leave to Daniel. The pressure to sell had been relentless, but coded in the language of concern. "Mom, you're rattling around in this big place all by yourself," Daniel would say, his voice heavy with manufactured worry. "What if something happens and you can't get to the phone? What if you fall and there's no one here to help you?" Rebecca had been more direct. "Margaret, you have to think practically. The maintenance costs alone on a house this size are astronomical, and the property taxes, they're just going to keep going up. You could sell this place, buy a lovely little condo in one of those active senior communities, and have plenty left over for your care." For your care. The phrase had become a euphemism for their inheritance, a way of talking about my money without acknowledging that it was, in fact, my money to do with as I pleased. I had resisted, but the daily logistics of living in an inaccessible house had worn me down. The isolation was profound. I couldn't get upstairs to my old bedroom, couldn't access the bathroom without significant difficulty, couldn't reach the kitchen cabinets that held my dishes and cooking supplies. The house that had once been my sanctuary had become a prison, and my jailers were offering me a key in exchange for everything I had worked for. The compromise, when it finally came, had seemed reasonable. I would sell the house, but instead of moving into a senior community, I would use the proceeds to buy a smaller, wheelchair-accessible home, where I could maintain my independence. Daniel and Rebecca would help me find the right place, and in return, I would update my will to ensure they were taken care of when the time came. That's when I made my first mistake. In a moment of weakness, overwhelmed by the complexity of house hunting while dealing with my physical limitations, I had added Daniel to my bank accounts. It was supposed to be temporary, just until we found the right property and completed the sale. He would be able to handle the financial transactions while I focused on my recovery. "It's just a precaution, Mom," he had said, his voice warm with filial concern. "Rebecca and I want to make sure you're protected. If something happens to you, if you have another stroke, we need to be able to take care of your affairs." Rebecca nodded earnestly. "It's what families do, Margaret. We take care of each other." The paperwork had been signed on a Tuesday morning in the sterile office of my longtime banker, a man who had known our family for decades. I hesitated for just a moment before signing, my pen hovering over the signature line, something deep in my gut whispering that this was a mistake. But Daniel had been there, his hand on my shoulder, and Rebecca had been making encouraging noises about the beautiful, accessible homes they had found online. I signed. The house sold within a week of listing, the Portland real estate market being what it was. The sale price was even higher than we had anticipated. Nearly $800,000 for a house my husband and I had bought for $65,000 back in 1987. After paying off the small remaining mortgage and the various fees and taxes, I had walked away with over $700,000. For a brief moment, I had felt wealthy, powerful, in control of my destiny. The money represented freedom, security, the ability to live comfortably for the rest of my life regardless of what my health might throw at me. I had plans. A beautiful, accessible home with a garden. Maybe a small travel trailer so I could see the country. Definitely a new car with hand controls so I could drive again. But those plans had required Daniel's cooperation, since he now had legal access to my accounts. And Daniel, I was beginning to realize, had plans of his own. The first red flag had been the delay in house hunting. Despite the urgency that had driven the sale of my original home, Daniel and Rebecca suddenly seemed to have all the time in the world when it came to finding me a replacement. There was always a reason why the accessible homes we looked at weren't quite right. Too expensive, too small, not in the right neighborhood, needing too much work. "We want to make sure we find you the perfect place, Mom," Daniel would say whenever I expressed frustration with the process. "This is a big decision. We can't rush it." Meanwhile, I was living in a cramped apartment that Daniel had found for me, a temporary arrangement that was stretching into months. The apartment was technically accessible, but it was also isolated, sterile, and depressing. The neighbors were strangers, the neighborhood was unfamiliar, and I felt more disconnected from my life than I had even in the immediate aftermath of my stroke. The second red flag had been the financial statements. As a retired accountant, I had always been meticulous about tracking my finances. I knew exactly how much money should be in each account, how much the investment should be generating, where every dollar was going. But suddenly, getting information about my own accounts had become complicated. Daniel had assured me that he was handling everything, that I didn't need to worry about the day-to-day financial management. "You just focus on getting better, Mom. Rebecca and I have everything under control." But when I insisted on seeing the statements, there were always delays. The bank was slow to process the requests. The statements were being mailed to the wrong address. The online access was having technical difficulties. Each excuse was plausible on its own, but taken together, they formed a pattern that my accountant's instincts couldn't ignore. The third red flag had been the changes in their behavior. Daniel, who had always been a thoughtful son, had become distant and distracted. Rebecca, who had never been particularly warm toward me, had become coldly efficient in her interactions, treating me like a client rather than a family member. They had started making decisions about my life without consulting me. The cable in my apartment was downgraded to save money. The cleaning service I had hired was canceled because it was unnecessary. The physical therapy appointments that were helping me regain strength and mobility were reduced from 3 times a week to once a week because the insurance only covered a limited number of sessions. Each change was presented as a reasonable cost-saving measure, but the cumulative effect was to make my life smaller, more constrained, more dependent on their goodwill and assistance. It was during this period of growing unease that the bus stop incident had occurred. I had been living in the temporary apartment for nearly 6 months, and my patience with the housing search had reached its breaking point. I had found a beautiful, accessible home on my own, a place that met all of my needs and was well within my budget. I had called Daniel excitedly to tell him about it, only to be told that he would need to review the financial implications before we could move forward. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The next morning, Rebecca had arrived at my apartment with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel had to go into the office early, but he asked me to take you to run some errands, she had said. We need to go to the bank to sort out some paperwork for your accounts. I had been eager to get out of the apartment, and the prospect of finally getting some clarity on my financial situation had overridden my growing wariness of Rebecca's motives. I had allowed her to help me into the wheelchair, had gathered my purse and jacket, and had let her push me out to the bus stop to wait for the number 12 bus that would take us downtown. The morning had been overcast, with the kind of drizzling rain that Portland residents learn to ignore, but that can soak you through if you're not prepared. Rebecca had positioned my wheelchair at the bus stop, had checked her phone, and had announced that she needed to go back to the apartment to get something she had forgotten. I'll be right back, she had said, her voice bright with false cheer. The bus doesn't come for another 20 minutes. You'll be fine. And then she had walked away, her heels clicking on the wet pavement, leaving me alone at the bus stop with the rain beginning to fall harder and a growing sense that something was very, very wrong. 20 minutes turned into an hour. The drizzle had escalated into a steady rain, and despite my jacket, I could feel the dampness seeping through to my skin. The bus stop's small shelter provided minimal protection, and the wind kept driving the rain at odd angles that seemed designed to find every gap in my defenses. I checked my phone repeatedly, both for the time and hoping for a message from Rebecca explaining her delay. The battery indicator showed only 15% remaining, another oversight that was beginning to feel less like carelessness and more like calculated neglect. Several buses had come and gone, their drivers glancing at me with mild curiosity before continuing on their routes. I wasn't getting on any of them because I was waiting for Rebecca, because I trusted that she would return as promised. The first hour of waiting, I made excuses for her. Traffic was terrible in Portland during morning rush hour. Maybe she had encountered an emergency at the apartment building. Perhaps Daniel had called with something urgent that required her immediate attention. These explanations felt reasonable, logical, the kind of minor crises that could derail anyone's carefully planned morning. But as the second hour began, and my phone battery dipped below 10%, a different kind of understanding started to crystallize in my mind. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't an emergency. This was intentional. I tried calling Rebecca's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Daniel's phone did the same. The automated voice cheerfully informed me that the person I was trying to reach was unavailable, as if unavailability was a choice rather than a weapon. By the third hour, my phone had died completely, and I was forced to confront the full scope of my situation. I was stranded at a bus stop in an unfamiliar neighborhood, soaked to the skin, with no way to contact anyone, and no clear plan for getting home. The apartment keys were in my purse, but the apartment was nearly 2 miles away, an impossible distance in a manual wheelchair, especially in this weather. More troubling than my immediate predicament was the growing realization of what this abandonment represented. Rebecca hadn't simply forgotten about me or encountered an unexpected emergency. She had deliberately left me here, vulnerable and isolated, as some kind of message or punishment. But for what? What had I done to deserve this casual cruelty? The answer came to me in fragments, pieces of conversations and observations that I had been unconsciously collecting for months. Rebecca's increasing impatience with my needs, Daniel's evasiveness about my finances, the way they had both started talking about my future as if it was theirs to decide, the convenient delays in finding me permanent housing, the restricted access to my own bank accounts. A man walking his dog stopped near the bus shelter, his expression shifting from casual indifference to concern as he noticed my situation. He was perhaps 60, with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. "Excuse me," he said, approaching cautiously. "Are you all right? You look like you've been here for quite a while." The simple human kindness in his voice nearly undid me. I had been abandoned by my own family, but a stranger was willing to stop and check on my welfare. I'm waiting for someone, I managed to say, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. They were supposed to be right back. He glanced at his watch, then at the darkening sky. How long have you been waiting? 3 hours, I admitted, and saying it out loud made the reality of my situation unavoidable. His face clouded with concern and something that looked like anger. 3 hours? In this weather? Do you have a phone? Can you call them? It died, I said, gesturing helplessly at the silent device in my lap. Without hesitation, he pulled out his own phone. Here, use mine. Call whoever was supposed to pick you up. I dialed Rebecca's number again, hoping against hope that this time she would answer, that there would be some reasonable explanation for her absence. But the call went directly to voicemail, and I found myself listening to her cheerful recorded voice promising to return calls as soon as possible. The man, who introduced himself as Frank Morrison, studied my face as I hung up without leaving a message. No answer? No answer. Frank's jaw tightened. Look, I don't know your situation, but leaving someone in a wheelchair at a bus stop for 3 hours in the rain isn't an accident. That's abandonment. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Someone else you can call? The question forced me to confront how isolated I had become since my stroke. My longtime friends from work had gradually faded from my life, partly because of my physical limitations, but mostly because I had become so dependent on Daniel and Rebecca for transportation and social connections. My neighbors from my old house were 30 miles away and barely knew about my current living situation. I have an apartment, I said finally, but it's about 2 miles from here, and I don't have a way to get there. Frank didn't hesitate. I can drive you. My truck has room for your wheelchair. The offer was generous, but also highlighted how completely I had been cut off from normal support systems. A stranger was willing to help me more than my own family had been. I don't want to impose, I started to say, but Frank cut me off. Lady, whoever left you here imposed on you. I'm just trying to fix their mess. As Frank helped me into his truck and loaded my wheelchair into the bed, I found myself telling him about Rebecca and Daniel, about the financial arrangements, about the growing sense that something was seriously wrong with my situation. He listened without judgment, his face growing darker as I described the pattern of control and isolation that had been gradually tightening around my life. You know, he said as we pulled up to my apartment building, I'm retired from the banking industry. Spent 35 years in fraud prevention. What you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse. The isolation, the control of your accounts, the deliberate creation of dependency. These are classic tactics. Financial elder abuse. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, partly because it was so clinical, and partly because it described my situation with such devastating accuracy. I wasn't just being neglected or manipulated. I was being systematically victimized by the people I trusted most. Frank helped me get back to my apartment, refusing my offers of payment and insisting on giving me his phone number. If you need help, he said, or if you just need someone to talk to who understands financial crimes, call me. And Margaret, start documenting everything. Dates, times, conversations, financial transactions. If my suspicions are right, you're going to need evidence. Alone in my apartment, I sat in my wheelchair by the window and tried to process what had happened. The abandonment at the bus stop hadn't been random cruelty. It had been a test, or perhaps a message. Rebecca had wanted to see if I would panic, if I would become helpless without their assistance. She had wanted to demonstrate how completely dependent I was on their goodwill. But she had miscalculated. Instead of making me feel more vulnerable, the experience had clarified something important. I wasn't helpless. I was isolated, yes, and I had been manipulated into a position of dependency, but underneath all of that, I was still Margaret Chen. I was still the woman who had built a successful career on seeing patterns others missed, on understanding the hidden structures that govern people's financial lives. For the first time in months, I felt angry instead of sad. Not the helpless, frustrated anger of someone raging against circumstances beyond their control, but the cold, focused anger of someone who had identified a problem and was ready to solve it. I charged my phone and called Rebecca's number again. This time, she answered on the second ring, her voice bright with false concern. Margaret, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I got back to the apartment and you were gone. I figured you must have taken the bus to the bank on your own. How did you get home? The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized this had been planned well in advance. She had expected me to panic, to call her desperately, to demonstrate my helplessness. When I hadn't done that, when I had simply disappeared from the bus stop, She had been forced to improvise this story about assuming I had left on my own. "A kind stranger helped me," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Someone who was concerned about an elderly woman sitting alone in the rain for 3 hours." There was a brief pause, a tiny crack in her cheerful facade. 3 hours? Oh, Margaret, you must have misunderstood. I was only gone for a few minutes. Maybe you lost track of time? The gaslighting was so blatant, so insulting, that it took my breath away. She was trying to convince me that my own perception of time was unreliable, that 3 hours of abandonment in the rain was somehow my fault or my confusion. "I see," I said carefully. "Well, I'm home now, safe and sound." "That's wonderful," Rebecca said, her relief audible. "Daniel will be so glad to hear it. We were worried when we couldn't reach you." Another lie. If they had been worried, they would have answered their phones. If they had been concerned about my welfare, Rebecca wouldn't have left me at a bus stop in the first place. After ending the call, I sat in my small apartment and began to apply the analytical skills that had served me so well throughout my career. I started with what I knew for certain. I had over $700,000 from the sale of my house. Daniel had legal access to those accounts. Rebecca had deliberately abandoned me as some kind of psychological manipulation. They were both lying about their actions and their motives. The question was, what were they hiding? I began to reconstruct the timeline of my financial arrangements, starting with the day I had added Daniel to my accounts. I had copies of some statements, though not recent ones. I had documentation of the house sale and the initial deposit of funds. I had a clear memory of my account balances at various points over the past 6 months. What I didn't have was current information about where my money was going. Frank Morrison's words echoed in my mind. Start documenting everything. I found a notebook and began to write down every interaction I could remember, every conversation about money, every delay and excuse and deflection. The pattern that emerged was damning. For 6 months, Daniel and Rebecca had been systematically isolating me from my own financial resources while positioning themselves as my caretakers and protectors. They had used my physical limitations and my trust in them to gain control of my assets, and now they were using psychological manipulation to keep me compliant and dependent. But they had made one critical error. They had underestimated me. I was Margaret Chen, the numbers whisperer, the woman who had saved dozens of businesses from financial ruin. I had spent 4 decades learning to see through lies, to trace money through complex webs of transactions, to identify the patterns that revealed people's true intentions. Daniel and Rebecca thought they were dealing with a confused, vulnerable old woman. They had no idea they had just provoked someone who understood exactly how to dismantle their entire scheme. As the rain continued to fall outside my window, I opened my laptop and began to plan their destruction. My first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, my own email account. While Daniel had gained access to my bank accounts, he had overlooked the digital paper trail that every financial institution automatically generates. Buried in my inbox were months of automated notifications, balance alerts, and transaction confirmations that painted a devastating picture of systematic theft. The initial revelation was staggering. According to the email alerts, over $200,000 had been transferred out of my primary savings account in the past 4 months. The transfers had been made in carefully calculated amounts, never more than $15,000 at a time, presumably to avoid triggering additional banking scrutiny. Each transaction had been authorized using Daniel's legal access to my accounts, but it was the destinations of these transfers that truly shocked me. Rather than being moved to legitimate care-related expenses, or even to Daniel's personal accounts, the money had been funneled into a complex web of investment vehicles and business entities. There were transfers to something called Emerald Holdings LLC, payments to Pacific Northwest Development Group, and regular monthly transfers to RD Luxury Consultants. None of these entities were familiar to me, and a quick internet search revealed that they were all recently formed limited liability companies with addresses that traced back to mail forwarding services. This wasn't random financial mismanagement. It was a sophisticated money laundering operation designed to hide the true destination of my assets. The sophistication of the scheme suggested that this had been planned long before my stroke, possibly even before my husband's death. Rebecca, with her marketing background, would have had the skills to create legitimate-looking business entities. Daniel, with his software expertise, would have understood how to structure digital transactions to minimize detection. They hadn't just taken advantage of my vulnerability after my stroke. They had been positioning themselves for this theft for years, waiting for the right opportunity to gain access to my assets. Armed with this information, I reached out to Frank Morrison. When I called his number, he answered immediately, his voice warm with genuine concern. "Margaret, how are you holding up? I've been thinking about you since yesterday." I told him what I had discovered in my email records, reading him the transaction details and business names. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he spoke again, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Margaret, this is much worse than I initially thought. We're not talking about simple financial abuse here. This is organized fraud, possibly involving money laundering and tax evasion. Those shell companies, the structured transactions, this is federal crime territory." Frank offered to meet me the next day to help me gather more evidence. "I still have contacts in the banking industry," he said, "people who specialize in exactly this kind of financial crime. But we need to be careful. If Daniel and Rebecca realize you're investigating them, they might accelerate their timeline or destroy evidence." That evening, I called my longtime attorney, James Patterson, a man who had handled my family's legal affairs for over 20 years. James had always been direct and honest with me, qualities I desperately needed in my current situation. "Margaret," he said after I explained the situation, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. Are you certain about these transactions? Is there any possibility that you authorized them and simply don't remember?" The question stung, but I understood why he had to ask it. Elder abuse cases often hinged on questions of mental capacity and memory. "James, I'm telling you that I never authorized any payments to entities I've never heard of. I never agreed to any investment schemes or business ventures. My memory is fine, and my judgment is intact." "I believe you," he said firmly. "And based on what you're telling me, we need to act quickly. Tomorrow, I'm going to file an emergency petition with the court to freeze all of your accounts pending investigation. This will prevent any additional unauthorized transfers. Won't that alert Daniel and Rebecca that I know what's happening?" "Yes," James admitted. "But at this point, stopping the bleeding is more important than maintaining the element of surprise. Once the accounts are frozen, we can work on recovering what's been stolen." The next morning, Frank arrived at my apartment with a briefcase full of documents and a laptop computer. He had spent the night researching the shell companies that had received my money, and his findings were even more disturbing than I had anticipated. "Emerald Holdings LLC was formed 6 months ago," he explained, spreading papers across my kitchen table. "The registered agent is a legal service company that specializes in anonymous business formations. But here's the interesting part. The timing of its formation corresponds exactly with when you added Daniel to your bank accounts." Frank had also discovered that RD Luxury Consultants wasn't just receiving monthly payments from my accounts. It was also making regular payments to high-end retailers, luxury car dealerships, and exclusive resort destinations. Rebecca and Daniel had essentially created their own personal shopping fund using my money. "Look at this," Frank said, pointing to a series of credit card statements he had obtained through his banking contacts. Rebecca's personal American Express shows charges that correspond exactly with the payments to RD Luxury Consultants. Designer handbags, jewelry, spa treatments, all purchased within days of money being transferred from your accounts. The evidence was overwhelming and infuriating. While I had been living in a cramped apartment, worried about every expense, Rebecca had been using my life savings to fund a luxury lifestyle that included designer clothing and expensive vacations. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: Rebecca's own social media accounts. Frank had found her Instagram and Facebook profiles, which told the story of the past 6 months in vivid, incriminating detail. The photo showed Rebecca wearing expensive jewelry while captioning posts about treating myself and investing in quality pieces. There were images of luxury spa days, expensive restaurant meals, and shopping trips to high-end boutiques. Most damning of all were the photos from a recent weekend trip to Napa Valley, staying at a resort that charged over $800 per night. Each of these expenses could be traced back to payments from my accounts to the shell companies, which then transferred the money to cover Rebecca's extravagant spending. She had been so confident in her scheme that she had documented her crimes on social media, creating a public record of her theft. "This is incredible," I said, scrolling through months of posts that chronicled Rebecca's spending spree. "She's practically confessing to the theft in real time." Frank nodded grimly. "Criminals often get caught because of their own arrogance. Rebecca thought she was untouchable, that you would never discover what they were doing. She got careless. As we compiled the evidence, a clearer picture emerged of the full scope of their operation. Daniel and Rebecca hadn't just stolen money. They had created an entire parallel financial system designed to obscure their theft while providing them with a steady stream of untraceable income. The business entities were just the beginning. Frank's investigation revealed that they had also opened credit cards in my name, taken out loans using my assets as collateral, and even established investment accounts that I knew nothing about. The total amount of my money they had accessed was approaching $400,000. But perhaps most shocking was the discovery of their future plans. Among the documents Frank had obtained were loan applications for a $700,000 mortgage on a luxury home in Seattle. The applications listed me as a co-signer and used my remaining assets as collateral, despite the fact that I had never seen the property or agreed to any such arrangement. "They're planning to buy a house using your money," Frank explained, his voice heavy with disgust. "And if something happens to you, they'll inherit everything anyway. It's the perfect crime. They get access to your money while you're alive, and they get the rest when you die." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft. It was a complete takeover of my financial life, designed to continue until every penny I had worked for was gone. Daniel and Rebecca had turned my trust into a weapon against me, using my love for my son to systematically destroy my financial security. But as I sat in my wheelchair, surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: power. For the first time since my stroke, I wasn't a victim waiting for others to make decisions about my life. I was Margaret Chen, and I was going to destroy them. The court order freezing my accounts was filed on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, my phone was exploding with panicked calls from Daniel. The first voicemail was confused, almost innocent in its bewilderment. "Mom, there's some kind of problem with the bank. They're saying there's a hold on all the accounts. I tried to transfer money for your care expenses, and they told me everything is frozen pending some kind of investigation. Can you call me back? This must be a mistake." The second voicemail, received an hour later, had a sharper edge. "Mom, I talked to the bank manager. They said you filed some kind of legal action. What's going on? Why would you freeze your own accounts? Rebecca and I are trying to help you, and now we can't access the money for your rent, your medical bills, any of it. This doesn't make sense." By the third voicemail, Daniel's veneer of concerned confusion had completely evaporated. "Margaret, this is ridiculous. I don't know what someone has told you, but freezing these accounts is going to hurt you more than anyone else. I'm the one managing your finances. I'm the one making sure your bills get paid. If you don't call me back and fix this immediately, you're going to be in serious trouble." I didn't call him back. Instead, I spent the evening with Frank and my attorney James, planning the next phase of our counterattack. The account freeze was just the beginning, a defensive move to stop the bleeding while we prepared for a more comprehensive offensive. "The criminal charges will take time to develop," James explained as we sat around my kitchen table, documents spread across every available surface. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit will need to build a case, and that could take months. But we can move much faster in civil court." Frank nodded in agreement. "The evidence we've gathered shows clear conversion of assets, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. We can file a civil lawsuit that will allow us to freeze their personal assets and demand immediate restitution." The beauty of the civil approach was that it would hit Daniel and Rebecca where they were most vulnerable: their newfound lifestyle and their future financial plans. The luxury items they had purchased with my money could be seized. The house they were planning to buy could be blocked. Their credit could be destroyed. "There's something else," Frank said, pulling out a folder I hadn't seen before. "I've been in touch with the IRS Fraud Division. Those shell companies Daniel and Rebecca created, they haven't been paying taxes on the money they've been funneling through them. We're looking at potential tax evasion charges on top of everything else." The scope of their legal exposure was staggering. Federal fraud charges could result in decades in prison. The IRS penalties for tax evasion could bankrupt them, even if they weren't convicted of the underlying crimes. The civil lawsuit could force them to repay not just the stolen money, but punitive damages that could triple or quadruple the amount. "They thought they were stealing from a helpless old woman," I said, looking at the mountain of evidence we had assembled. "They had no idea they were stealing from someone who knew exactly how to destroy them." The next morning, James filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Daniel, Rebecca, and their shell companies. The complaint detailed every fraudulent transaction, every forged document, every lie they had told to gain access to my money. More importantly, it included a request for an immediate restraining order that would freeze all of their assets pending the outcome of the case. The legal papers were served on Daniel and Rebecca simultaneously at their respective workplaces, a deliberate choice designed to maximize their humiliation and ensure they couldn't coordinate their responses. Daniel was served at his software company's downtown Seattle office during a client meeting. Rebecca served at the marketing firm where she worked, in front of her colleagues and supervisor. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within hours, both of them had been suspended from their jobs pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. Their employers, faced with employees who had been accused of major financial crimes, had no choice but to distance themselves from the potential scandal. But the real shock came when they tried to access their own financial resources and discovered that the court order had frozen everything: their bank accounts, their credit cards, their investment portfolios, even the lease on their luxury apartment. Overnight, they had gone from living high on my stolen money to being financially paralyzed. Daniel's phone calls became increasingly desperate and hostile. He left messages accusing me of being manipulated by predatory lawyers, of betraying my own family, of destroying the people who had been trying to take care of me. Rebecca, meanwhile, tried a different approach, showing up at my apartment building and demanding to see me. I watched from my window as the building's security guard turned her away, her face twisted with rage and panic. She was no longer the composed, manipulative woman who had orchestrated my abandonment at the bus stop. She was a cornered criminal who was finally facing the consequences of her actions. The psychological warfare continued for several days. Daniel sent emails alternating between threats and attempts at emotional manipulation. Rebecca tried to enlist mutual acquaintances to plead her case, painting herself as the victim of a vindictive old woman who had lost touch with reality. But their efforts to control the narrative fell apart when the local news media picked up the story. Frank had strategically leaked selected details to a reporter who specialized in financial crimes, and the resulting article painted a devastating portrait of elder abuse and betrayal. The headline read, "Local son and daughter-in-law accused of stealing hundreds of thousands from disabled mother." The article included quotes from experts on elder abuse, statistics about financial crimes against seniors, and carefully worded descriptions of the evidence against Daniel and Rebecca. Most damaging of all, the article included several of Rebecca's Instagram photos showing her wearing expensive jewelry and enjoying luxury spa treatments, with captions indicating the dates of purchase that corresponded exactly with transfers from my accounts. The public exposure was the final blow to their carefully constructed facade. Rebecca's social media accounts were flooded with angry comments from people who had read the article. Daniel's professional reputation was destroyed. Word spread quickly through Portland's tight-knit tech community about his arrest for fraud. Their attempts to hire legal representation hit another obstacle when they discovered that their frozen assets included the money they would have used to pay attorney fees. The court-appointed public defenders who took their case were competent but overworked, no match for the resources that James and I could bring to bear. But the most satisfying aspect of our counterattack wasn't the legal maneuvering or the public humiliation. It was the gradual revelation of how thoroughly we had outplayed them at their own game. Frank had discovered that Daniel and Rebecca's financial planning had been built entirely around their continued access to my money. They had leveraged their expected inheritance to secure loans, credit lines, and investment opportunities that they couldn't possibly sustain without the steady flow of stolen funds. The house they had been planning to buy in Seattle was just the tip of the iceberg. They had also committed to a luxury car lease, a vacation timeshare, and several high-risk investment schemes that required substantial ongoing capital contributions. Their entire lifestyle had become a house of cards, and by cutting off their access to my money, we had sent the whole structure tumbling down. "Look at this," Frank said, showing me the latest financial documents his contacts had obtained. "They've defaulted on 3 different loans in the past week. The car dealership has started repossession proceedings. The timeshare company is threatening legal action." The irony was perfect. Daniel and Rebecca had used my money to create the illusion of wealth and success, but that illusion required constant feeding. Without access to my accounts, they couldn't maintain the financial commitments they had made, and their carefully constructed new life was collapsing around them. "They're going to lose everything," I realized, looking at the cascade of defaulted payments and broken contracts. Not just the money they stole from me, but everything they thought they had built with it. James nodded grimly. "Fraud has a way of unraveling people's lives completely. They didn't just steal money, they built a false life on top of that theft. Now that the foundation is gone, everything else is coming down too." As I sat in my wheelchair, reviewing the latest reports of their financial destruction, I felt a satisfaction, deeper than simple revenge. For months, Daniel and Rebecca had treated me like an obstacle to be managed, a source of inconvenience and embarrassment. They had abandoned me at a bus stop like unwanted baggage, confident that I was too weak and confused to fight back. They had been catastrophically wrong. I wasn't just an old woman in a wheelchair. I was Margaret Chen, the numbers whisperer, and I had just orchestrated the complete financial destruction of the people who had betrayed me. But this was only the beginning. The civil lawsuit would recover my stolen money and destroy their financial future. The criminal charges would send them to prison. The IRS investigation would ensure that even if they somehow escaped the other consequences, they would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. Daniel and Rebecca had thought they were abandoning a helpless victim at that bus stop. Instead, they had awakened a predator who was about to systematically dismantle everything they had built on the foundation of their theft. The game wasn't just one. It was a complete and total annihilation. 3 weeks after the initial lawsuit was filed, the full scope of Daniel and Rebecca's desperation became apparent when they attempted something that shocked even my battle-hardened attorney. They filed a countersuit claiming that I was mentally incompetent and that they had been acting as my legitimate caregivers, making financial decisions in my best interest. The legal filing painted a picture of me as a confused, paranoid woman who had been manipulated by unscrupulous advisors into believing that my loving family was stealing from me. According to their version of events, every transaction had been authorized by me for legitimate care expenses, and my current legal action was the result of age-related cognitive decline and the influence of people who wanted to exploit our family conflict. It's a desperate move, James explained as we reviewed their counter-complaint in his office. They're essentially arguing that you're not mentally competent to manage your own affairs, which means they're asking the court to give them legal guardianship over you and your finances. The audacity of their strategy was breathtaking. Having stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from me, they were now claiming that I was too mentally impaired to understand what had happened, and that they should be given legal authority to continue managing my money. If they succeed, James continued, they could potentially gain control of everything you have left. The court would appoint them as your guardians, and all of your financial decisions would require their approval. Frank, who was sitting beside me during this meeting, shook his head in disgust. It's the ultimate gaslighting move. They steal someone's money, and when they get caught, they claim their victim is too crazy to understand reality. But their strategy contained a fatal flaw that they hadn't considered. By claiming that I was mentally incompetent, they had opened the door for us to demand comprehensive mental health evaluations by court-appointed experts. More importantly, they had essentially admitted that they had been making financial decisions without my knowledge or consent, which was exactly what we had been accusing them of all along. Let them try, I said, feeling a cold satisfaction as I considered the implications. I've spent 43 years analyzing complex financial data and making strategic business decisions. Any competent psychological evaluation will show that my mind is as sharp as it ever was. The court ordered comprehensive mental health evaluations for all parties involved in the case. Daniel and Rebecca had requested the evaluations, expecting them to support their claims about my mental state, but they hadn't considered that their own psychological profiles would also be scrutinized. Dr. Sarah Williams, the court-appointed psychologist who conducted my evaluation, was a specialist in elder abuse cases with particular expertise in financial crimes. Her assessment involved 3 days of comprehensive testing, including cognitive evaluations, memory tests, and extensive interviews about my decision-making processes. The results were unequivocal. Dr. Williams concluded that I had no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or any other condition that would affect my ability to make financial decisions. Her report noted that my analytical skills were exceptional for someone of any age, and that my understanding of complex financial instruments was sophisticated and accurate. Mrs. Chen demonstrates remarkable mental acuity, Dr. Williams wrote in her official report. Her recall of financial details is precise, her understanding of legal concepts is sophisticated, and her decision-making process shows clear logical reasoning. There is no evidence of any cognitive impairment that would justify questioning her competence to manage her own affairs. Daniel and Rebecca's psychological evaluations told a very different story. Dr. Williams identified patterns of narcissistic behavior, financial irresponsibility, and what she termed, quote, exploitative relationship dynamics. Her report noted Daniel's tendency to justify unethical behavior through self-serving rationalization and Rebecca's history of manipulative tactics designed to control and exploit others. Most damaging was Dr. Williams' conclusion that both Daniel and Rebecca showed signs of believing their own lies about their motivations. They had convinced themselves that their theft was somehow justified, that they deserved access to my money, and that their luxurious lifestyle was a reasonable reward for the burden of caring for me. The psychological evaluations destroyed their competency argument, but they also provided us with powerful ammunition for the broader case. Dr. Williams' report became a roadmap for understanding their criminal psychology and predicting their future behavior. Meanwhile, Frank's investigation had uncovered new layers of their deception that went far beyond the financial theft we had initially discovered. Using his contacts in the banking industry, he had traced their shell companies' activities and discovered that they had been operating a more sophisticated scheme than we had realized. "Look at this," Frank said, spreading new documents across my kitchen table. "They weren't just stealing from you. They were using your money as capital for a broader investment fraud scheme." The evidence showed that Daniel and Rebecca had been taking my stolen money and investing it in high-risk ventures that promised quick returns. They had been gambling with my life savings, hoping to multiply the stolen funds and potentially replace what they had taken before I discovered the theft. Several of these investments had failed spectacularly, losing tens of thousands of dollars in risky real estate ventures and cryptocurrency schemes. Other investments were still active, but the projected returns would never be sufficient to cover the amounts they had stolen. They were trying to steal enough money to cover up their original theft, I realized as Frank walked me through the complex web of investments and losses. They thought they could gamble their way out of the hole they had dug. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was that they had also been defrauding other elderly relatives. Frank's investigation revealed that Rebecca's grandmother had died 6 months earlier under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind a substantial inheritance that had mysteriously disappeared shortly after her death. "I contacted the executor of the grandmother's estate," Frank explained. "Rebecca was supposed to receive about $60,000, but she convinced the family that the money should be invested in some kind of family business venture. That money was funneled through the same shell companies they used to launder your funds. The pattern was clear and chilling. Daniel and Rebecca weren't just opportunistic criminals who had taken advantage of my vulnerability after my stroke. They were serial elder abusers who had developed a systematic approach to identifying, grooming, and financially exploiting vulnerable family members." "How many other people have they done this to?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Frank's expression was grim. "I've identified at least 3 other potential victims, elderly relatives, or family friends, who have had significant financial losses that coincide with Daniel and Rebecca's involvement in their affairs. The FBI is now investigating this as a pattern of elder abuse, rather than an isolated incident." The revelation transformed our case from a family dispute into something much larger and more serious. Federal prosecutors were now considering charges under the Elder Justice Act, which carried enhanced penalties for systematic financial abuse of seniors. Daniel and Rebecca weren't just facing theft charges. They were potentially looking at federal racketeering accusations. Their legal situation continued to deteriorate as the broader investigation expanded. The IRS had completed their preliminary audit of the shell companies and determined that Daniel and Rebecca owed over $100,000 in back taxes and penalties. The state tax authorities had opened their own investigation into potential income tax evasion. Most devastating was the discovery that their attempts to hide their assets had violated multiple court orders. While their accounts were frozen, they had continued trying to move money through relatives and friends, creating additional criminal charges for contempt of court and obstruction of justice. "They can't stop themselves," James observed as we reviewed the latest evidence of their ongoing attempts to hide assets. "Even when they know they're being watched, they keep trying to manipulate the system. It's like they're incapable of accepting that they've been caught." The psychological profile that Dr. Williams had developed explained this self-destructive behavior. Daniel and Rebecca had built their entire self-image around being clever manipulators who could outsmart their victims and the legal system. Accepting defeat would require acknowledging that they were not the sophisticated criminals they believed themselves to be, but rather obvious fraudsters who had been caught by their own victim. Their inability to accept reality led to increasingly desperate and illegal attempts to salvage their situation. They tried to suborn witnesses, attempted to hide assets with friends and relatives, and even made veiled threats against me and my legal team. Each of these actions created additional criminal charges and provided more evidence of their criminal intent. What had started as a financial crime case was evolving into a comprehensive criminal conspiracy with dozens of individual charges. At this point, James explained during one of our weekly strategy meetings, they're facing potential prison sentences of 20 to 30 years each. The financial restitution alone will bankrupt them for life, even if they somehow avoid conviction on the criminal charges. But the most satisfying aspect of their downfall wasn't the legal consequences. it was watching their carefully constructed facade crumble in public. The local news media had continued following the story, and each new revelation painted them in an increasingly negative light. Rebecca's former colleagues at the marketing firm had provided statements to investigators about her extravagant spending and her boasts about having access to family money. Daniel's co-workers had described his increasing arrogance and his dismissive comments about having to care for his difficult mother. The social media posts that had initially provided evidence of their spending had become a public relations nightmare. Local news stations had obtained permission to use Rebecca's Instagram photos in their reports, creating a visual timeline of her luxury lifestyle funded by stolen money. Their former friends and social circle had completely abandoned them. The couple who had once been invited to every exclusive event in their social set were now social pariahs, whispered about at parties as cautionary tales about greed and betrayal. "I saw Rebecca at the grocery store yesterday," Frank told me during one of our meetings. "She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past month. She was buying generic brands and counting coupons. It's quite a change from the woman who was posting pictures of $100 spa treatments just a few weeks ago." The complete reversal of their circumstances was more thorough than anything I could have planned deliberately. They had gone from living a luxury lifestyle on my stolen money to barely being able to afford basic necessities. Their professional reputations were destroyed, their social standing was obliterated, and their legal future looked increasingly hopeless. As I sat in my wheelchair reviewing the latest reports of their continued downfall, I realized that they had created their own perfect punishment. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of theft and lies, and now that foundation was collapsing, taking everything they valued with it. Daniel and Rebecca had abandoned me at a bus stop, thinking they were discarding an inconvenient burden. Instead, they had awakened their own destruction, and I was watching with satisfaction as everything they had stolen from me was systematically stripped away from them. 6 months after that rainy morning at the bus stop, I found myself sitting in the federal courthouse in downtown Portland, watching as Daniel and Rebecca made their final desperate attempt to avoid complete destruction. Their last-ditch strategy was as audacious as it was doomed. They had decided to represent themselves in court after their third set of attorneys withdrew from the case. The attorney withdrawals had been the result of their own self-sabotage. Each legal team had quit after discovering that Daniel and Rebecca had been lying to them about crucial facts, withholding evidence, and continuing to commit crimes, even while under investigation. The final straw came when their most recent lawyer discovered that they had been secretly recording their privileged conversations, apparently planning to use the recordings to somehow shift blame to their own legal counsel. "Your Honor," Daniel said, standing awkwardly at the defendant's table, "we believe this entire case is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship with my mother. We were acting as her caregivers and financial advisors, making decisions that we believed were in her best interests." Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman with over 20 years of experience in financial crimes, looked at Daniel with barely concealed skepticism. The evidence against him and Rebecca filled 17 bankers' boxes and included everything from bank records to social media posts to secretly recorded conversations. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Morrison said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's silence, "you are asking this court to believe that transferring over $400,000 to shell companies that you created, using that money to purchase luxury items for your wife, and then attempting to hide these transactions from your mother, were all actions taken in her best interests?" Daniel's response was a rambling, incoherent attempt to justify the unjustifiable. He claimed that the luxury purchases were, quote, "investments that would eventually benefit me." He argued that the shell companies were legitimate business ventures that would generate returns for my retirement. He insisted that his decision to hide the transactions was to protect me from the stress of managing complex financial decisions. Rebecca's testimony was even more damaging. She had decided to take the stand against the advice of everyone who still cared about her welfare, apparently believing that her charm and manipulation skills would work on the federal judge, just as they had worked on vulnerable family members. "Your Honor," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the same sweetly condescending tone she had used with me for years. "Margaret has always been a very controlling person. She never appreciated the sacrifices Daniel and I made to take care of her after her stroke. We were working 24 hours a day to manage her affairs, and we felt we deserved some compensation for our efforts." The admission was stunning. Rebecca had just confessed to the court that she believed she was entitled to steal my money as payment for services I had never requested and did not want. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly severe as Rebecca continued her testimony. digging herself deeper into legal quicksand with every word. "Mrs. Hayes, are you telling this court that you believed you had the right to take hundreds of thousands of dollars from your mother-in-law's accounts without her knowledge or consent?" "We weren't taking anything," Rebecca insisted, her voice rising with indignation. "We were managing her money more effectively than she could. Look at how much we increased the value of her portfolio through our investment strategies." The problem with Rebecca's claim was that their investment strategies had actually lost money. Frank's forensic analysis had shown that my accounts would have been worth nearly $200,000 more if Daniel and Rebecca had simply left the money in the original savings accounts and certificates of deposit. "Mrs. Hayes," Judge Morrison said, her voice now carrying a tone of disbelief, "the evidence shows that your investment activities resulted in substantial losses to your mother-in-law's portfolio. How do you reconcile your claim of financial expertise with the documented losses?" Rebecca's answer revealed the full depth of her delusion. "Those weren't losses, Your Honor. Those were temporary market fluctuations. Our long-term strategy would have been very profitable if Margaret hadn't interfered with our plan." The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Rebecca's statement sank in. She was arguing that my decision to stop them from stealing my money had interfered with their plan to steal my money more effectively. Even Daniel seemed to realize that Rebecca's testimony was destroying any remaining chance they had of avoiding conviction. He attempted to distance himself from her statements, claiming that the investment decisions had been made without his knowledge and that he had been manipulated by his wife. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice cracking with desperation, "I was just trying to help my mother. Rebecca convinced me that these financial arrangements were legal and appropriate. I trusted her judgment because of her background in business." The attempt to throw Rebecca under the bus was met with immediate retaliation. Rebecca turned on Daniel with a fury that shocked everyone in the courtroom, including their own legal advisor, who had remained only to assist with procedural matters. "That's a lie," Rebecca screamed, pointing at Daniel. "You were the one with access to the accounts. You were the one who created the shell companies. I just helped you figure out how to spend the money." What followed was a spectacle that would have been comical if it hadn't involved the systematic theft of my life savings. Daniel and Rebecca began arguing with each other in open court, each trying to shift blame to the other, each revealing new details about their crimes in their desperate attempts to avoid responsibility. "You were the one who suggested we buy the jewelry," Daniel said, his voice rising to match Rebecca's volume. "You were the one who said your mother would never notice the missing money," Rebecca shot back. "You were the one who wanted to buy the house in Seattle. You were the one who said we deserved to live better than some old woman in a wheelchair." Judge Morrison finally restored order by threatening both of them with contempt of court, but the damage was done. In their mutual accusations, Daniel and Rebecca had provided the court with a detailed confession of their crimes, complete with admissions of intent to defraud and evidence of their callous disregard for my welfare. The prosecution had barely needed to present their case. Daniel and Rebecca had effectively prosecuted themselves through their own testimony and their spectacular courtroom meltdown. But the legal proceedings were only part of their downfall. During the 6 months leading up to the trial, their personal and professional lives had completely disintegrated in ways that were both predictable and satisfying. Daniel's career in software consulting had ended abruptly when his employer discovered the criminal charges. The technology industry, with its emphasis on trust and security, had no tolerance for employees accused of financial crimes. Word had spread quickly through professional networks, ensuring that Daniel would never work in his chosen field again. Rebecca's situation was even worse. Her marketing firm had not only fired her, but had also sued her for damages, claiming that her criminal behavior had damaged the company's reputation with clients. Several major accounts had canceled their contracts after learning about Rebecca's legal troubles, resulting in substantial financial losses for her former employer. Their social circle had completely abandoned them. The couple, who had once been fixtures at exclusive charity events and private parties, found themselves uninvited and unwelcome everywhere they had once belonged. Their former friends crossed the street to avoid encountering them in public. The financial consequences had been immediate and devastating. With their assets frozen and their income eliminated, Daniel and Rebecca had been forced to move out of their luxury apartment and into a cramped studio in one of Portland's least desirable neighborhoods. They had lost their cars, their furniture, and most of their personal belongings to creditors and asset seizure orders. Rebecca's prized jewelry collection, much of it purchased with my stolen money, had been confiscated as evidence and would eventually be sold to help pay restitution. The designer clothing that had filled her social media posts was gone, replaced by thrift store purchases and donations from the few relatives who still maintained minimal contact with them. But perhaps the most symbolically satisfying aspect of their downfall was their transportation situation. Daniel, who had once driven a luxury BMW lease purchased with my money, was now dependent on public transportation. Rebecca, who had mocked my use of a wheelchair and had abandoned me at a bus stop, was now herself waiting at bus stops daily, unable to afford any other means of getting around the city. The irony was perfect and poetic. They had left me stranded at a bus stop, thinking they were abandoning a powerless victim. Now they were the ones dependent on public transportation, their luxury lifestyle reduced to counting bus fare and checking schedules. Their attempt to declare bankruptcy had been blocked by the court pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Even if they were somehow able to avoid prison time, which seemed increasingly unlikely, they would be required to pay full restitution plus penalties and interest. The financial obligations would follow them for the rest of their lives. Frank had calculated that even if Daniel and Rebecca devoted every penny of their future earnings to paying back what they had stolen, they would need to work for over 30 years to satisfy the judgment. The interest and penalties alone would ensure that they would never be able to rebuild the lifestyle they had stolen from me. They've essentially sentenced themselves to a lifetime of poverty, Frank explained as we reviewed the latest financial projections. Even if they both found well-paying jobs tomorrow, which is unlikely given their criminal records, they would be living at subsistence level for decades to come. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Dr. Williams had conducted follow-up evaluations of Daniel and Rebecca as part of the ongoing court proceedings, and her reports painted a picture of two people whose sense of identity had completely collapsed. Daniel, who had built his self-image around being a successful professional and dutiful son, was now facing the reality that he was a federal criminal who had betrayed his own mother. The cognitive dissonance was causing severe depression and anxiety that required psychiatric medication. Rebecca's narcissistic personality structure was proving even less resilient under pressure. Her entire sense of self had been built around external validation, social media attention, luxury possessions, the admiration of others. With all of these sources of validation stripped away, she was experiencing what Dr. Williams termed narcissistic collapse, a psychological state characterized by rage, depression, and an inability to accept reality. They're both struggling with the fact that their victims turned out to be more powerful than they were, Dr. Williams explained in her report. Their sense of superiority was based on their ability to manipulate and exploit others. When that power was not only taken away but turned against them, it destroyed their fundamental understanding of themselves and their place in the world. As I sat in the courthouse, watching Daniel and Rebecca's final desperate performance before Judge Morrison, I felt a profound sense of closure that went beyond simple revenge. These two people had seen my physical limitations and assumed they represented mental and emotional weakness. They had mistaken my trust for naivete and my love for my son as something they could exploit indefinitely. They had been catastrophically wrong on every count. My wheelchair hadn't made me weak. It had made me more determined. My age hadn't made me confused. It had given me decades of experience in recognizing and defeating exactly the kind of financial manipulation they had attempted. Most importantly, they had underestimated the power of someone who had spent 43 years learning to see through lies and uncover hidden truths. I wasn't just Margaret Chen, the woman they had abandoned at a bus stop. I was Margaret Chen, the numbers whisperer. And I had just orchestrated the complete and total destruction of the people who had betrayed me. The trial was nearly over, but their punishment was just beginning. Judge Morrison's verdict came down like thunder on a clear day, though everyone in the courtroom knew what was coming. After 3 days of deliberation, the federal jury had found Daniel and Rebecca guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, money laundering, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. The conviction carried a maximum sentence of 45 years in federal prison for each defendant. Mr. Hayes and Mrs. Hayes, Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You have been found guilty of systematically defrauding a vulnerable family member who trusted you with her financial security. Your crimes were not impulsive mistakes but calculated acts of greed that continued over many months, even after you knew you were under investigation. Daniel stood at the defendant's table, his face ashen and his hands trembling. Rebecca sat rigidly beside him, her carefully maintained facade finally cracked beyond repair. Neither of them looked at me as Judge Morrison continued her statement. The evidence presented in this case reveals a pattern of financial abuse that extended beyond the primary victim to multiple elderly relatives. You created sophisticated schemes to hide your theft, attempted to manipulate the legal system to avoid responsibility, and showed no genuine remorse for the devastating impact of your actions. The sentencing phase would come later, but the judge's preliminary remarks made it clear that Daniel and Rebecca were facing substantial prison time. The federal sentencing guidelines, combined with their lack of cooperation and their attempts to obstruct justice, virtually guaranteed that they would spend the next decade or more behind bars. They built their entire identities around a lifestyle that was funded by theft, Dr. Williams explained in her summary. When that lifestyle was stripped away, they lost not just their possessions but their sense of who they were. They're essentially starting over at middle age with nothing but debt and criminal records. The ripple effects of their crimes had extended far beyond their immediate family. Rebecca's parents, who had initially supported their daughter, had been forced to acknowledge the overwhelming evidence of her guilt and had cut off all contact. Daniel's cousins and extended family members had distanced themselves from the scandal, leaving both convicted criminals without any meaningful family support. Their former friends and social contacts had not only abandoned them but had actively shunned them. Several people from their old social circle had provided statements to investigators about Daniel and Rebecca's boastful comments about their access to family money and their dismissive remarks about caring for an elderly relative. The social media accounts that had once documented their luxury lifestyle had become evidence of their crimes. Rebecca's Instagram and Facebook pages were now cited in court documents and news articles as examples of how criminals flaunt their illegal gains. The photos of expensive jewelry and luxury vacations would forever serve as a public record of her greed and callousness. Local news media had continued following the story through the trial and sentencing, ensuring that Daniel and Rebecca's names would be permanently associated with elder abuse and financial fraud. A simple internet search of their names would forever return results describing their crimes and convictions. But the most satisfying aspect of their downfall wasn't the legal punishment or even the financial destruction. It was the complete reversal of the power dynamic that had existed when they abandoned me at that bus stop. For months before their arrest, Daniel and Rebecca had treated me like an inconvenient burden whose needs and wishes were secondary to their own comfort and convenience. They had made decisions about my life without consulting me, had controlled my access to my own money, and had isolated me from friends and support systems that might have helped me recognize their manipulation. Now I was the one with power and control. Every aspect of their future would be determined by legal proceedings that I had initiated. Their ability to work, to travel, to own property, even to open a bank account would be restricted by the judgment I had obtained against them. The physical symbolism was equally satisfying. Daniel and Rebecca, who had once driven luxury cars and lived in an upscale apartment, were now dependent on public transportation and subsidized housing. They were the ones waiting at bus stops, checking schedules, and dealing with the inconveniences of life without financial resources. Meanwhile, I had used the recovered funds to completely transform my own circumstances. With the restitution payments and the liquidation of their seized assets, I had been able to purchase a beautiful, accessible home in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods. The house featured wide doorways, ramps instead of stairs, and a fully adapted kitchen that allowed me to cook independently for the first time since my stroke. I had also purchased a modified van with hand controls, giving me the freedom to drive myself wherever I wanted to go. No longer was I dependent on others for transportation or at the mercy of their schedules and convenience. The recovered money had allowed me to hire a wonderful caregiver named Maria, a certified nursing assistant, who helped with the physical tasks that remained challenging for me while respecting my independence and decision-making authority. Unlike Daniel and Rebecca, Maria treated me with dignity and genuine concern for my welfare. Most importantly, I had regained control over my own financial affairs. With the help of a new financial advisor who specialized in elder financial security, I had restructured my investments to ensure that my money would last for the rest of my life, while providing appropriate inheritance for deserving family members, a category that emphatically did not include Daniel. The legal victory had also brought me into contact with other elder abuse survivors who had faced similar experiences. I had become involved with a nonprofit organization that helped elderly victims of financial crimes, using my background in accounting to help identify fraudulent schemes and my personal experience to counsel other victims. "You've turned your victimization into a source of strength for other people," Frank observed during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Daniel and Rebecca thought they were destroying your future, but they actually gave you a new purpose." The work with elder abuse victims was deeply satisfying in ways that my original accounting career had never been. Each case I helped resolve felt like another victory against the kind of people who preyed on vulnerable seniors. Each family I helped reunite felt like a rebuke to Daniel and Rebecca's cruelty. 6 months after their sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call from the federal prison where Daniel was serving his sentence. He wanted to arrange a visit, claiming he had something important to say to me. After discussing it with James and Frank, I decided to meet with him. Not out of any desire for reconciliation, but out of curiosity about what he thought he could possibly say that would matter to me now. The federal prison was a stark, institutional building that seemed designed to strip away any pretense of dignity or comfort. Daniel, wearing a standard prison uniform and looking 20 years older than his actual age, sat across from me in the visiting room with his hands folded and his eyes downcast. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize for what we did to you. I want you to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did." I looked at this broken man, who had once been my son, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Daniel, you spent months stealing my money, lying to my face, and treating me like an inconvenient burden. You abandoned me in a wheelchair at a bus stop in the rain. What exactly didn't you intend?" He had no answer for that question, because there was no answer. Every action he and Rebecca had taken had been deliberate and calculated. The only thing they hadn't intended was to get caught. "I know you probably can't forgive me," he continued, "but I hope someday you might be able to understand that I was trying to take care of you in my own way." The lie was so transparent, so obviously rehearsed, that it confirmed everything I had believed about his character. Even now, sitting in federal prison as a convicted felon, Daniel was still trying to manipulate me with the same self-serving justifications he had used throughout his crimes. "Daniel," I said, standing up to leave, "you weren't taking care of me, you were stealing from me. And the difference between those two things is why you're sitting in prison while I'm living in a beautiful home that I bought with the money I recovered from your theft." As I left the prison and drove home in my modified van, I reflected on how completely the tables had turned since that rainy morning at the bus stop. Daniel and Rebecca had thought they were abandoning a helpless victim who would have no choice but to accept whatever they decided was best for her. Instead, they had awakened Margaret Chen, the numbers whisperer, a woman who had spent 4 decades learning exactly how to destroy people who thought they were smarter than she was. They had left me at a bus stop in my wheelchair, thinking they were discarding an inconvenient burden. I had left them at the bankruptcy court in theirs, and that's exactly where they belonged. 3 years had passed since that transformative morning when everything changed, and the ripple effects of my victory continued to expand in ways I could never have anticipated. The Margaret Chen Foundation had grown from a personal mission into a nationally recognized organization that had helped recover over $40 million for elder abuse victims across the country. Our success rate was unprecedented in the field of elder financial recovery. The combination of my accounting expertise, Frank's banking industry knowledge, and Dr. Williams' psychological insights had created an investigative methodology that was being adopted by law enforcement agencies nationwide. "You've essentially created a new field of criminal investigation," explained Detective Sarah Martinez, who had become the lead senior crimes investigator for the Portland Police Department. "Before your case, most agencies treated elder financial abuse as isolated family disputes. Now we understand it as organized crime that requires sophisticated investigative techniques." The Foundation's newest initiative was a training program for financial professionals to help them identify the early warning signs of elder abuse. Banks, investment firms, and insurance companies were sending their employees to workshops where I shared my story and taught them to recognize the patterns that criminals like Daniel and Rebecca used to exploit their victims. One particularly satisfying aspect of this work was training bank tellers and customer service representatives to spot the red flags that might have saved me months of suffering if someone had been paying attention. The signs were always there. Unusual transaction patterns, elderly customers accompanied by controlling relatives, sudden changes in long-established banking habits. "Mrs. Chen," said Jennifer Walsh, a bank manager who attended one of our training sessions, "I wish I had known what to look for when your son was making those transfers. We processed dozens of transactions from your accounts, and if we had been trained to recognize the pattern, we might have been able to stop the theft much earlier." The banking industry had embraced our training program with surprising enthusiasm. Elder financial abuse cost financial institutions millions of dollars annually in fraud losses and regulatory penalties, so they had strong incentives to prevent these crimes from occurring. Several major banks had implemented new protocols based on our recommendations, including mandatory waiting periods for large transfers involving elderly customers and requirements for independent verification of financial decisions made by relatives or caregivers. The legal precedents established by my case had also transformed how prosecutors approached elder abuse crimes. The successful use of RICO charges against Daniel and Rebecca's criminal network had inspired similar prosecutions across the country, leading to the dismantling of numerous elder abuse operations. Your case proved that these criminals could be prosecuted as organized crime syndicates rather than individual bad actors, explained U.S. Attorney Patricia Coleman, who had led the prosecution team. That change in legal strategy has been crucial to breaking up these networks and preventing them from simply moving to new locations when they get caught. The federal task force on elder crimes that had emerged from my case had become a permanent investigative unit with offices in 12 major cities. The task force had achieved a conviction rate of over 90% in elder abuse cases, a dramatic improvement from the historically low prosecution rates for these crimes. Frank had officially joined the task force as a consultant, using his retirement from banking to become a full-time advocate for elder abuse victims. His expertise in financial forensics had proven invaluable in tracing complex money laundering schemes and identifying hidden assets. Working on your case changed my entire perspective on retirement, Frank told me during one of our monthly foundation board meetings. I thought I would spend my golden years playing golf and traveling. Instead, I found the most meaningful work of my entire career, helping people fight back against these predators. The psychological research component of our foundation's work had yielded groundbreaking insights into the family dynamics that made elder abuse possible. Dr. Williams had published several academic papers based on our case studies, fundamentally changing how mental health professionals understood the relationship between family loyalty and criminal exploitation. Her research had identified specific personality traits that made certain individuals susceptible to becoming elder abuse perpetrators, as well as family dynamics that created vulnerability in potential victims. This work was being used to develop screening tools for families and intervention strategies for high-risk situations. The data we've collected shows that elder abuse is often a multi-generational pattern, Dr. Williams explained during a presentation at a national gerontology conference. Families that normalize financial exploitation of elderly members often have histories of similar behavior spanning decades. One of the most rewarding aspects of the Foundation's work was directly helping individual victims recover from their experiences. We had established a victim support network that provided both practical assistance with financial recovery and emotional support for dealing with the trauma of family betrayal. The support groups I facilitated included elderly people from all walks of life who had experienced similar betrayals by trusted family members. Sharing our stories and supporting each other through the recovery process had created bonds that felt more like family than the relationships we had lost to criminal exploitation. Meeting you and hearing your story gave me hope that I could fight back, said Robert Kim, a 74-year-old retired teacher whose daughter had stolen over $200,000 from his retirement accounts. I thought I was too old and too trusting to ever get justice, but your example showed me that we don't have to be victims forever. Robert's case had become one of our foundation's most successful recoveries. Using the investigative techniques we had developed, we had been able to trace his daughter's spending, identify hidden assets, and ultimately recover almost the entire amount she had stolen. His daughter was now serving a 7-year federal sentence, and Robert had regained both his financial security and his sense of personal power. The media attention surrounding our work had led to a documentary film about elder financial abuse that featured my story prominently. The film, titled "The Numbers Don't Lie: Fighting Elder Financial Abuse," had been shown at film festivals across the country and had generated significant public awareness about the scope of these crimes. The documentary had also caught the attention of Hollywood producers who wanted to adapt my story into a feature film. While I was initially skeptical about the entertainment industry's ability to treat such a serious subject with appropriate gravity, the proposed script had impressed me with its commitment to accuracy and its focus on empowerment rather than victimization. They want to show that elderly people can fight back and win, explained the screenwriter, who had spent weeks interviewing me about my experiences. Too many movies portray seniors as helpless victims. Your story proves that age and physical limitations don't have to mean powerlessness. The prospect of my story reaching a mass audience through a major motion picture was both exciting and daunting. On one hand, it could help millions of elderly people recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and understand that they had options for fighting back. On the other hand, I worried about sensationalizing what had been a deeply personal and painful experience. My speaking engagements had taken me across the country to address conferences, legislative hearings, and community groups. Each presentation was an opportunity to educate people about elder financial abuse, and to advocate for stronger legal protections for vulnerable seniors. One of my most memorable speaking engagements was at a congressional hearing on elder abuse prevention. Sitting before a panel of senators and representatives, I testified about the inadequacy of existing laws and the need for federal legislation that would treat elder financial abuse as the serious crime it represented. Senators, when criminals steal from banks, we call it robbery and prosecute it as a federal crime, I told the committee. When criminals steal from elderly Americans, we often treat it as a family dispute. This double standard must end if we are serious about protecting our most vulnerable citizens. The hearing had led to bipartisan support for the Elder Financial Protection Act, comprehensive legislation that would create federal criminal penalties for financial abuse of seniors and establish funding for victim recovery programs. The bill was expected to pass both houses of Congress and become the most significant elder protection legislation in decades. My relationship with law enforcement had evolved from victim seeking justice to expert consultant helping solve complex cases. Police departments regularly contacted our foundation for assistance with elder abuse investigations, particularly cases involving sophisticated financial schemes. You've become the go-to expert for elder financial crimes, Detective Martinez told me. When we have a case that involves complex financial manipulation, you're the first person we call. Your ability to see through these schemes is better than any investigative software we have. The consulting work had led to the development of new investigative techniques that were being adopted by law enforcement agencies nationwide. Our foundation had created training materials, investigative checklists, and analysis tools that had dramatically improved the success rate of elder abuse prosecutions. One case that particularly demonstrated the effectiveness of our methods involved an 81-year-old woman whose son-in-law had been systematically draining her investment accounts through a series of fake business ventures. Using our investigative framework, police had been able to trace the money through multiple shell companies and recover over $300,000 in stolen funds. Without the techniques your foundation developed, this case would have been impossible to solve, the investigating detective explained. The financial transactions were so complex that we would never have been able to follow the money trail using traditional methods. The international scope of elder financial abuse had also become apparent through our work. Criminal networks like the one that had included Daniel and Rebecca often operated across national borders, making international cooperation essential for effective prosecution. Our foundation had begun working with Interpol and other international law enforcement agencies to share information about elder abuse schemes and coordinate investigations of transnational criminal operations. This work had led to the discovery of elder abuse networks operating in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Elder financial abuse is a global problem that requires global solutions, explained Agent Michael Torres of the FBI's International Crimes Division. The techniques that work in the United States are being adapted by criminals worldwide, so we need to share our countermeasures and coordinate our responses. The personal satisfaction I derived from this work went far beyond the practical accomplishments of recovering money and prosecuting criminals. Each victory felt like another vindication of my decision to fight back rather than accept victimization, another proof that age and physical limitations need not mean powerlessness. The transformation of my own life had been equally dramatic. The accessible home I had purchased with recovered funds had become a gathering place for elder abuse survivors, foundation board meetings, and strategy sessions with law enforcement. The house that Daniel and Rebecca had tried to prevent me from buying had become the headquarters for a movement that was changing how society addressed elder financial abuse. My daily routine now included activities that would have been impossible during the months when I was isolated and controlled by my son and daughter-in-law. I drove myself to meetings, managed my own finances, and made decisions about my time and resources without seeking anyone's permission or approval. The physical therapy and adaptive equipment that I had been able to afford with the recovered funds had significantly improved my mobility and independence. While I would always need some assistance with certain tasks, I was no longer the vulnerable, dependent person that Daniel and Rebecca had tried to convince me I was. You've reclaimed not just your money, but your entire sense of self, Dr. Williams observed during one of our regular consultations. The work you're doing now represents the full flowering of capabilities that were suppressed during the period of abuse. In many ways, you're more powerful and effective now than you were before your stroke. The irony of this observation was not lost on me. Daniel and Rebecca's crimes had been intended to destroy my independence and reduce me to a manageable dependent who would never threaten their access to my assets. Instead, their betrayal had awakened capabilities and passions that had transformed me into a formidable advocate for elder rights. As I reflected on the journey from that rainy morning at the bus stop to my current role as a national expert on elder financial abuse, I was struck by the completeness of the transformation. The helpless woman they had abandoned had become the architect of their destruction and the creator of a movement that would protect thousands of other elderly people from similar exploitation. The Foundation's latest annual report showed that our work had directly resulted in the recovery of over $60 million for elder abuse victims and had led to the prosecution of more than 200 criminals involved in systematic elder exploitation. These numbers represented not just financial recoveries, but lives reclaimed and dignity restored. Daniel remained in federal prison, serving what would likely be the remainder of his productive adult life. His appeals had been exhausted, his co-conspirators had either died or been convicted, and his future held nothing but the grinding routine of institutional life, and the knowledge that his crimes had been instrumental in creating the very system that was now protecting his potential victims. The bus stop where Rebecca had abandoned me had been designated as a memorial site for elder abuse victims, with a small plaque recognizing the transformation that had begun at that location. I visited the site occasionally, not out of nostalgia but as a reminder of how completely circumstances could change when someone refused to accept victimization. They had left me at a bus stop in my wheelchair, thinking they were discarding an inconvenient burden. I had left them at the bankruptcy court in theirs, and that's exactly where they belonged. The months that followed brought unexpected developments that made their punishment even more comprehensive than I had initially imagined. The FBI's investigation had expanded beyond Daniel and Rebecca to include their network of accomplices and enablers, resulting in additional arrests and prosecutions that dismantled an entire ring of elder abuse criminals. Frank had been instrumental in helping federal investigators trace connections between my case and similar crimes across the Pacific Northwest. His banking industry contacts had identified patterns of suspicious activity that linked Daniel and Rebecca to at least 12 other cases of financial elder abuse spanning 3 states. They weren't just random criminals, Frank explained as we reviewed the expanded investigation files. They were part of a sophisticated network that shared information about vulnerable targets and money laundering techniques. Your case broke open an entire criminal enterprise. The revelation that my son had been part of an organized elder abuse ring was perhaps more shocking than his original betrayal. This wasn't a family dispute that had gotten out of hand or a moment of weakness that had spiraled into something larger. Daniel had deliberately joined a criminal organization that specialized in systematically exploiting elderly victims. Rebecca's role in the network had been even more extensive than initially realized. Investigation of her background revealed that she had been involved in similar schemes long before she married Daniel, including a case in California where she had defrauded her former employer's elderly clients out of over $300,000. She targeted Daniel specifically because of his access to you, Dr. Williams explained in her updated psychological profile. She identified him as someone with a wealthy elderly parent and cultivated the relationship as part of a long-term criminal strategy. Your marriage to Daniel wasn't romantic. It was a business arrangement designed to give her access to your assets. The FBI's investigation had uncovered detailed communications between Rebecca and other members of the criminal network, including step-by-step instructions for identifying vulnerable elderly targets, gaining their trust, and systematically draining their assets. The communications revealed that Rebecca had been teaching other criminals how to replicate their successful techniques. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a training manual that Rebecca had created for new members of the network. The document, titled Family First Financial Solutions, provided detailed instructions for manipulating elderly family members into surrendering control of their finances. The manual included sections on identifying vulnerability indicators, building dependency relationships, and managing victim resistance. It read like a textbook for psychological manipulation, complete with scripts for common conversations and strategies for isolating victims from potential sources of help. "Look at this section," Frank said, pointing to a particularly chilling passage in the manual. She literally provides templates for gaslighting elderly victims who begin to suspect financial abuse. She teaches people how to make their own family members doubt their own perceptions and memories. The existence of the training manual led to federal racketeering charges under the RICO Act, which carried additional penalties and ensured that Daniel and Rebecca would face even longer prison sentences. More importantly, the manual provided evidence that could be used to prosecute other members of the network who had victimized elderly people across multiple states. The expanded investigation revealed the staggering scope of the criminal enterprise. Federal prosecutors estimated that the network had stolen over $15 million from elderly victims over a 5-year period. The victims ranged from wealthy retirees to middle-class seniors who had lost their entire life savings to sophisticated fraud schemes. One of the most heartbreaking cases involved an 82-year-old veteran who had been convinced by his own nephew to invest his disability benefits in fake business ventures. The veteran had lost over $200,000 and had been forced to move in with distant relatives after losing his home to foreclosure. Another case involved a widow who had been systematically isolated from her children by a daughter-in-law who claimed the children were only interested in their inheritance. The woman had transferred over $400,000 to various investment schemes before a concerned neighbor contacted authorities. Each of these cases follows the same pattern your case did, Frank explained as we reviewed the victim impact statements: isolation, dependency creation, financial manipulation, and gaslighting. Rebecca and Daniel had perfected a system that worked across different family dynamics and economic circumstances. My testimony had become crucial to prosecuting other members of the network. As one of the few victims who had successfully fought back and recovered their assets, I was able to provide insights into the criminals' methods that helped investigators understand how the schemes operated. The victim advocacy work I had begun had expanded into a full-time consulting role with the FBI's Elder Crimes Unit. My background in accounting, combined with my personal experience as a victim, made me uniquely qualified to help investigators trace complex financial transactions and understand the psychological tactics used to manipulate elderly victims. "You've become their worst nightmare," Frank observed with satisfaction. "They thought they were victimizing a helpless old woman, but instead, they created an expert witness who can destroy their entire operation." The consulting work was deeply fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. Each case I helped solve felt like another victory against the network that had tried to destroy my life. Each criminal I helped convict was another blow against the system that had trained Daniel and Rebecca to exploit their own family members. The financial recovery from the expanded investigation had been substantial. As more assets were seized from other members of the network, additional funds became available for victim restitution. The federal asset forfeiture program had recovered over $8 million in stolen funds, much of which was distributed to victims who had previously thought their money was gone forever. My own restitution had been increased as investigators discovered additional assets that Daniel and Rebecca had hidden with accomplices. Bank accounts in other states, investment portfolios held by associates, and even cryptocurrency wallets had been identified and seized as part of the broader investigation. The total amount recovered on my behalf eventually exceeded $600,000, more than the original amount they had stolen. The additional funds represented not just the return of my money, but punitive damages and interest that reflected the true cost of their crimes. With the increased settlement, I was able to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting elder abuse victims and funding research into financial crimes against seniors. The Margaret Chen Foundation for Elder Financial Security became a permanent legacy of my fight against the criminals who had tried to destroy my life. The foundation's first major initiative was funding a study of family-based elder abuse, research that would help identify warning signs and develop prevention strategies. The study, conducted by Dr. Williams and her colleagues, promised to provide crucial insights into how criminals like Daniel and Rebecca operated within family systems. "Your foundation is going to save thousands of elderly people from experiencing what you went through," Dr. Williams explained as we discussed the research project. "The data we collect will help families recognize the early signs of financial manipulation and give them tools to protect themselves." The public attention surrounding the case had also led to legislative changes at the state and federal level. Oregon had passed new laws strengthening penalties for elder financial abuse and requiring financial institutions to report suspicious activity involving elderly customers. At the federal level, Congress had introduced legislation that would create a national database of elder abuse criminals and require background checks for anyone seeking to gain financial authority over elderly relatives. The proposed law was called the Margaret Chen Act, in recognition of my role in exposing the scope of organized elder abuse. "Your case didn't just get justice for you," James explained as we reviewed the proposed legislation. "It's changing the entire legal framework for protecting elderly Americans from financial predators." Meanwhile, Daniel and Rebecca's prison experience had become increasingly difficult as other inmates learned about their crimes. Elder abuse and crimes against family members were particularly despised in the prison environment, making them targets for harassment and violence. Daniel had been placed in protective custody after several incidents where other prisoners had confronted him about his crimes. Rebecca had experienced similar problems at the women's federal prison where she was serving her sentence, requiring multiple cell transfers and restrictions on her movement within the facility. Their prison records showed a pattern of disciplinary problems and conflicts with both staff and other inmates. Neither of them had adapted well to the institutional environment, and both had been denied early parole consideration due to their continued attempts to manipulate the system. "They're serving a hard time in every sense of the phrase," Frank reported after receiving updates from the federal prison system. "They're isolated, despised, and completely powerless. Exactly the opposite of how they used to treat you." The psychological evaluations conducted during their imprisonment showed that neither Daniel nor Rebecca had developed genuine remorse for their crimes. Both continued to blame external factors for their situation and maintained that they had been unfairly prosecuted for trying to help their family. Dr. Williams' final assessment concluded that both criminals exhibited personality disorders that made rehabilitation unlikely. Her report recommended that they serve their full sentences without early release, as they posed a continued threat to elderly and vulnerable populations. 2 years after their conviction, I received notice that Rebecca had died in federal prison. The official cause of death was listed as complications from a drug overdose, though the circumstances suggested suicide. She had apparently been unable to cope with the complete destruction of the life she had built on stolen money, and the prospect of spending the next decade behind bars. Daniel's reaction to his wife's death had been typically self-serving. He had requested compassionate release, claiming that his grief made it impossible for him to serve his remaining sentence. The request was denied, with the judge noting that Daniel had shown no compassion for his victims and deserved none in return. Rebecca chose to end her own life rather than face the consequences of her actions, Frank observed when we discussed the news. Even in death, she was trying to escape responsibility for what she did to you and all the other victims. Daniel's remaining prison sentence stretched ahead of him like a wasteland. With Rebecca dead and his appeals exhausted, he faced the prospect of spending his remaining years as exactly what he had become, a powerless, forgotten criminal whose name would forever be associated with betraying the trust of his own mother. As I sat in my beautiful, accessible home, surrounded by the security and independence I had reclaimed through my fight against their crimes, I reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred since that rainy morning at the bus stop. Daniel and Rebecca had seen my wheelchair and assumed it represented weakness and vulnerability. They had mistaken my trust for naivety and my love for exploitable sentiment. They had calculated that an elderly woman with physical limitations would be an easy target for their sophisticated criminal enterprise. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. My wheelchair hadn't made me weak. It had given me a different perspective on power and justice. My age hadn't made me confused. It had provided me with decades of experience in seeing through lies and uncovering hidden truths. Most importantly, they had underestimated the fury of someone who had spent 43 years learning exactly how to destroy people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. They had left me at a bus stop in my wheelchair, thinking they were discarding an inconvenient burden. I had left them at the bankruptcy court in theirs, and that's exactly where they belonged. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.